I'd like to welcome you. I'm Martha Rands. I'm the legal director of the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society. And we have been offering free 1 hour legal lunch and learns since April, really, when the pandemic was announced as formally. And it's a way for us to hopefully deliver to the nonprofit sector answers to questions that perhaps you've always had, but some of them also are that much more important in light of the restrictions, limitations, and demands that we're all working under as a consequence of COVID and the pandemic. Today, we're here to talk about my favorite topic, not to bylaw or not to bylaw. That's my way of understanding the world of policies. What we find often is people put policies in sets of bylaws because they don't know what else to do, or they don't have policies at all. And it's a topic that Alison and I have talked about many times. Alison Brewin, as many of you know, is the executive director of Vantage Point. In her prior life, she was executive director of West Coast Leaf for some period of time, many years, and a consultant to the nonprofit sector who's worked with many nonprofits on a variety of issues, notably around evaluation. She is the co-creator of the legal self-assessment tool that we are now actually turning into a digital platform called the Digital Self-Assessment and Legal and Learning Tool. We'll have a name for it soon. And she is also the co-creator of the full-day Legal Issues for Nonprofits bootcamp that we started working on, I think, in 2014. But it might be even earlier than that. In any event, I'm really, really glad that Alison is here today to unpack with us the magic, the mystery of policies. Well, take it away, Alison.
Well, that's a lot of expectation there. Thank you, Martha. Yeah, it's a joy and a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to share my thoughts with you about policies and how to kind of think it through. I've got a few PowerPoint slides to help us along in the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen to go there. Here we go. Get it into slide format. There you go. Is that looking okay for everybody? Great. So yeah, so thank you, Martha, for that. Martha and I have worked together for many years now on various things about the nonprofit sector and how best to help organizations try to be all they can be and all they want to be. And I joined Vantage Point in 2018. Yes, that's right. The spring of 2018. So it's been 2.5 years now. And today I'm going to try to move through these slides and then we'll have lots of room for discussion. I also just want to pause for a second and acknowledge that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I'm on the lands of the Stolo Nation here on the banks of what the colonialists and settlers call the Fraser River. It's a beautiful spot, and I feel very, very grateful for the opportunity to be here, and very grateful to the elders of the Stolo Nation who have cared and nurtured this area for so long. It's more than an honor. It's a huge privilege. So thank you to the Stolo Nation among all the Coast Salish peoples. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to just say a few words about Vantage Point for those of you who might not know us. I see from the participant list lots of friends and colleagues and partners that I know, and lots that I don't know too. So I'll share a couple words about us. I'll talk about the role of policies and how they fit into the picture of an organization, and break it down a little bit around the kinds and the reasons for policies. And I'm sure some of you are in various places when it comes to having policies for the organization. And we'll just look at some key policy areas. And then we're going to end with a fun quiz, at least my talking part. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So I am going to share the PowerPoint with Cleo after, and you guys, and I hope it will be accessible to you in that form. So yeah, so you don't need to necessarily take notes. So for those of you who don't know, Vantage Point is an organization here, mostly in Vancouver area, but we serve the whole province, and we now have a staff member who lives in Kamloops, JP Baker. So we have people in various places now. But we convene, connect, equip nonprofit leaders to help lift your organizational capacity. We provide high impact learning opportunities, and we also provide consulting and supports of various kinds. So we have a number of open enrollment workshops you can come to, and we do custom training. We also convene the sector in a variety of ways and provide support to the sector to advocate on behalf of our members. And we have about 650 members. And our membership is free, by the way, during COVID till the end of the year. So I don't want to grab a membership before the end of December because we are going to have to start charging fees again at some point. Anyway, but there's two things I just want to alert you to that are happening right now in this area of sector development. One is the No Immunity Survey. So if any of you filled out the first one in May that we did, it's a partnership with the Vancouver and Victoria Foundations and the City of Vancouver, and it's really important. So the report that we did in the May really helped funders and government and the sector itself understand what the pain points were around the impact of COVID. And this report is going to be equally important, and we're timing it to be out before the provincial budget so that we can advocate for support for the sector across the board. And then we have our BOSS conference that's coming up, and you can go to our website to find out more about that. But that's a big event happening, a virtual event at the end of February for a number of days through the following week. Yeah, so I'm just going to leave it there because you're here to talk about policies. Yay, policies. So just to be clear around just this simple framework around how policies fit, the idea is that there's a laws that are created that the government enacts and that the judicial system also enacts. So this is a little bit too simplistic in that we have common law principles that interpret any written laws. But laws exist around, and the one that we're most familiar with as nonprofits would be the Societies Act, because most of you would be registered under the BC Provincial Societies Act. But there's a federal act as well. So you might be registered as a national organization, or you may be registered as co-op or even a private corporation, possibly, though I suspect there are not too many of you in that situation on this call. The next thing is that the next layer of guidelines for an organization would be the Constitution, and that obviously would describe your purpose as an organization and therefore your mission. And then the next layer down, where you get a bit even more detailed, would be your bylaws. Your members approve your constitution, and if you make constitutional changes, your members also approve your bylaws, and you can't change them without knowing who your members are and engaging them appropriately. But policies are passed usually by the board, but there are policies, and this sort can get confusing, that may be operational policies that your staff pass and approve. That the board doesn't need to approve. So there's only certain policies that the board should have in place as opposed to operational policies. And one of the areas that gets confusing is around HR policies, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So there's two kinds of policies. There's prescriptive policies and there's proscriptive policies. So prescriptive policies are where it's a directive. We will do this. We will build an operating reserve. We will pay above average salaries. We will consult with our members every 6 months. Anything that's saying this is what we're going to do. And a prescriptive policy will really flesh out your bylaws and add to, sorry, there's a poll in progress, by the way, that popped up. So good to know if you all can fill that out while we're going. I'll keep talking now. And then there's proscriptive. So there's policies in which you're limiting something. So you're clarifying the boundary around something. So a limitation based, for example, would be we won't accept donations from fossil fuel companies, or the ED can't spend more than a certain amount without board approval, or well, you can imagine what I mean. So it is helpful to think about well, what are you trying to accomplish with this? Are you trying to make a statement about what you require the organization to do, or what you want to bound the organization to? And the bylaws obviously are prescriptive, so it should be things that you absolutely want the members to have approved as a structure for the organization, and defining. But you can have lots of prescriptive policies that you wouldn't put in your bylaws. For example, the question of an operating reserve and what your sort of rules as an organization are around that. That would be something you create a policy for. So it's helpful to think, what are we trying to accomplish? The second thing to consider when you're looking at policies is, why are you doing the policy? So the what is this something we're trying to do to limit or to set a prescriptive pathway? The second is the why are you doing it? And frankly, if there's reactive and proactive. So any of us that advise nonprofits would advise you to focus on being proactive about the creation of a policy, because most often we're in the situation where we're being reactive, where we realize that a problem has occurred. It may be to the extent of a crisis, or it may be a perceived problem, and we think maybe there's a problem, but we're not totally clear. And because we don't really have policy, we're not sure how to act. So we think, okay, well, let's draft a policy, and then we'll be clear about how to act. The challenge, of course, is that they're often confusing for future people, if that's why you've created it. Because they're articulated in the context of a current situation that often you'll find you'll create a policy that is too specific to that situation. So being clear about why you're doing it. If you are doing it reactive, the reaction to a problem is the push that often gets an organization to develop a policy, and that's not a bad thing, because good policy is important in my mind. But it needs to be, it's better if you're being proactive about it. The other reality is that processes that exist to manage current problems rarely solve a crisis. So if you're in a crisis, it's more important to deal with the crisis first. And then in the moment of having got to the other side, sit down and go, how could a policy perhaps have supported this differently? And what do we want to have in place for the future organization? One thing I will say is that boards are, I think it was Peter Eckel who's written a lot of board stuff for universities and academic institutions. The line I've heard is, a board's job is to protect the future of the organization from the present. So thinking about it that way, thinking about policies that consider the future direction and what do you want to bind the organization to some degree. The reality is that a policy passed by a board can be changed by a board in the future, but at the same time it forces some consideration of that policy. So a proactive process would involve setting annual reviews for policies. The thing we generally advise at Vantage Point is that you stagger them so that every 2 years you check in on different policies that you have in place. But that the board have some process for annually saying, okay, how are our policies? Do we need to rethink these? Do we need to add anything? It's good to have a committee dedicated to it, or be clear which committee is responsible for which policy. So if you have a finance committee and they're responsible for policies, have it in their calendar to look over the policies on a regular basis. You do want to engage staff and expert engagement. So at Vantage Point, we talk about governance not as just simply equaling board. Governance is actually senior staff and board together, because you delegate a lot of governance decisions to senior staff members. So what's the engagement in terms of building policies that work for everyone? Getting a legal review of policies, that's much easier to do in the context of a proactive approach as opposed to reactive. And ensure that your policies, if you're being proactive about it, you're going to be better at ensuring they're part of clarity around what your goals values, and most importantly, your mission are. So just to think that through, starting with the concept of your organizational culture is really important in developing good proactive policies, because you want to do it, you want to be realistic. If you're a really formal, structured, corporate-like organization, and that you're quite large, probably you have complex systems, complex policies, well, complex practices, I should say. You have complex locations, even multi-locations. Then being clear about what your culture is as an organization before you start into the pathway of developing policies. It's about your values. So your values often are the ones that lead to prescriptive policies. So do we believe in the importance as an organization of an operating reserve, or do we believe that every dollar we get needs to go out to a program or a service, and that we shouldn't be saving money because it all has to go out to everybody all the time? So if you have that value, then know that, and don't create an operation policy just because someone tells you it's best practice. So if you thought about culture, you can create some of those kinds of prescriptive policies that say we won't accept fossil fuel funding, that kind of stuff. The proscriptive ones do tend to be about process. So what's the boundaries around process? And those processes are practices you already have in place. There's a good chance that if you don't have a policy about something, either the staff or the board have been following a certain kind of practice. And how many times I've heard boards say, we don't do it that way. We do it this way, but there's no actual policy in place that says they do it that way. It's just a practice they've developed over the years. Maybe there were minutes at some point of a meeting in which they passed a motion, but they never captured it in a policy. So what are the processes that you currently have underway? And the structure is usually what's defined by the bylaws. So how many board members, what are their terms? You might include committees in there, at least the basic committees. Most standard bylaws have a nominating committee, possibly finance and audit committee. But what's the structure of the organization to some degree? Having said that, the structure should always also be defined by the culture, and it usually is. So these things go back and forth between them. But it's important to consider before you jump into drafting a whole bunch of new policies. So the role of board policies, so policies that the board has an eye on, they act as a framework for the board to help them make decisions. So if they're confronted by, we could go this way or that way, if there is some policy on that, whether again it's a values-based policy or a limitation-based policy, then that can help make decisions, as do strategic goals, which I actually think having some clarity of goals and priorities is almost more important in lots of circumstances for decision making than a policy. But they act as a framework. They can provide guidance about how to implement the decision. They can create expectations for board members that are consistent across the board, so it's clear, and some boundaries around communications and other things. They provide really valuable orientation and training for everyone involved. So a good way for your entire community of your organization to understand some of the bottom lines for your organization, like what are the basics that everybody should know. And it really does protect the rights, not just of clients and staff, but of board members, of volunteers, of those you serve, of your members. It is an important tool for making sure, for example, if it may be in your bylaws that, you have your AGM, that's going to be in your bylaws, how often you have to have it, it's required by law. But you may have, your members, you may have a strong value around accountability to members, which means that you want to connect with them more than once, more than at the AGM, that you want to actually go a bit farther and say there's certain things that we want to engage with our members about. And that is especially true for a membership-based organization, for trade associations, for those kinds of nonprofits. Some key governance policies. Role descriptions for the board chair, for any key players, the team like on the board. You might, some groups have, if you're a chair of a committee, here's your role description. That could be a generic description or not. Is this a policy? Yeah, actually it is a policy. Conflict of interest policy and code of conduct, very, very, very important, because we don't always know when those situations are going to arise. So having some clarity, again, keeping these policies as clear and simple as makes sense for the kind of organization you are. So, I mean, an example is I'm on the board at UBC, and their conflict of interest policy and code of conduct is ginormous and long and complex and important to read. And Vantage Point's on a staff team of 15 is 2 pages. So policies that explain key board responsibilities such as financial governance, signing authorities, that kind of stuff, reviewing executive director performances. So what's the policy on that? How often is it done? How is it done? How is the ED involved in it? How are the staff involved in it? How are external stakeholders involved? Board self-assessment practices, another really important part of understanding how you take care of yourself as a board. So here's another slide that just kind of breaks it down a slightly different way, but there's a few specific policies. Operating guidelines, again, usually you would have some clarity, some basic HR and staff policies that are approved by the board to ensure that the organization is following legal requirements as an employer, but you may have more detailed practices and policies that are relevant to the staff members that the board may not be involved in. Yeah, so a policy manual is always helpful to have. And again, e-versions, obviously, of these things are probably more clear. Having some kind of guidelines around evaluations, templates, any of these things can be in a board process, policy or manual, at least some kind of job. So, well, basically it's for an orientation manual, but all of these things would require some decision-making at some point, approval of the board. Financial policies are really around regulatory compliance and ensuring that you're complying with best practice and various regulatory obligations. So looking at things like payments to directors, are there travel expense reimbursements, who has access to bank accounts, for example, and how those are accessed, those details. And then HR policies, usually these are kind of 6 categories of things that you want to have in a basic board policy that you might have passed by the board. Again, it depends a bit on the size of the organization and how things are delegated, but around recruitment, compensation, there might be a values-based policy. We have one at Vantage Point about, our goal is to have above average salaries. So that creates processes around every 2 years. We do compensation reviews, for example. Codes of conduct for the staff in this case and volunteers may be included in that as well. Conflict resolution, disciplinary processes, etc. So now I'll just talk a little bit about just how to make these happen, and then I'll stop. So if you want to be proactive about it, you start by gathering up what documents, information you currently have about how things are done. You kind of study your current practices. You figure that out first. Then you look at your missions and values, and both spoken and unspoken. And that can take some digging. That can be not always, if you think of the iceberg, sometimes the values are buried. So it's important to try to be explicit about them. And a clear statement of why you're there. What's the job that you're here to do? So that would be the mission usually, and vision. Governance, what's your structure? How do your committees, your volunteers work together and interact? What are your practices? And then looking at where are the confusing moments? Where does there need to be clarity? And that will define what kinds of policies you might want to create for that. And then define who does what, help to clarify who's responsible, who's accountable to whom. That's where terms of reference for a committee is really important to describe are they responsible to the board, and do they need to report to the board? What decisions do they get to make or not make? And where are they accountable to the staff? You might have a committee that is made up of board members, but it's actually reporting to the ED because it's an advisory committee of some kind. Define issues and challenges for the organization as a whole. So you can see, again, it's a little bit about seeing where are the pain points and where can we clear this up by having a good policy. And then remember that writing policies is really putting on paper what you already do. So it's forcing the organization to articulate what it already probably is doing and make sure you're all on the same page. You want to be as plain language as you possibly can, because all present company accepted, of course. Lawyers have a tendency to write policies that confuse people in the future. And so you want to think about, imagine that board member, say 8 years from now, picking up this policy and reading it, or the new ED that gets hired 5 years from now, picking it up and looking at it. Will they understand it? Will it make sense? And will it help them? If it won't help them, it's probably not a good policy. Be consistent across the board in terms of the format. So start with a template, like just get someone to draft a template and then follow that same template. And there's lots available out there in various sources. So, and then be clear who's going to. Is it a task force where the board members are writing the draft policies? Are you asking your staff to do it? Who's going to be doing it? And is the staff the best person? Sometimes the ED is the best person to be drafting policy. Because they are the ED nonprofit manager expert in the organization, but it's also much easier for the ED if a board pulls together the skills and capacity to do it as well. So what should be in your bylaws and what should be policy? This is the big moment for the fun quiz. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think stop share. There we go. And I am going to let and so the question here, with the poll, is to go through each one and just think, should this be a policy or should this be bylaw? All up to you.
Here's another spot where we could use a Clio playlist.
That's true. There's some good comments in the chat, by the way.
Yes.
Sometimes boards are reluctant to do this because they think it'll be too much work, or that they will lose autonomy. Oh, that's interesting. It's a bit of a flag if your board is worried about losing autonomy, because they should never be acting autonomously from their senior staff, frankly, in my mind. So the submit button does not work.
That's odd.
Some people are able to submit, so maybe it's going in and you don't know it. Oh. Oh, I see. You need to answer all of them for the submit button to work. The results will come. We'll share them once everyone's had a chance to respond. This is the fun part, right, Martha?
Yes. It's fun. It's fun. It's fun. Really, really, really. I know you all thought you'd left high school, but guess what? It's back. Everybody's favorite experience, I'm sure. Speaking as a high school dropout, though, maybe not mine.
Can I answer some of the questions that are on the thing, or should I wait?
Well, perhaps we'll go to the ones that were sent ahead of time. And one was, well, this is more of they're all more bylaw questions. Yeah, sure, choose one and we can talk about it. Yeah. Which one do you want to choose?
If your members are, this is a controversial one actually. If your members are the board of directors, is any other oversight needed? I think Martha and I might have different opinions about this. I don't know. I'm not a fan of the closed membership structure because I don't think it's very democratic, because there is no other oversight for the board if they're the members. So yeah. Yeah,
I mean, you know, I think that kind of question is really going to depend a great deal on what the organization is doing. If you're a community and social service employer that's CARF accredited and has audits and a very potentially, you know, quite sophisticated staff structure, you may be subject to a collective agreement. There's all kinds of checks and balances that are engaged internally in organizations like that. And those tend to be the ones that I tend to see where the members are the directors and that's it.
Because
So
on the basis that they have other accountabilities,
exactly.
like funders and contracts and CARP
Precisely.
accreditations and things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, and BC Housing is on them,
Right.
and you know, there's accountability up, you know, a lot of accountability. Another group where you would also see a lot of that would be Indigenous-led organizations tend to have quite limited memberships where the members are the directors representing specific regions or band councils. And as a consequence, again, there's a very different accountability structure within most First Nations that actually governs most activities of the society. It's still important to distinguish between members and directors in that context. But from the point of view of governance, very often those two, that differentiation doesn't operate because that's not how they function in their communities. They're accountable to their community first. And so the level of accountability is actually hardwired
Right.
into the setup. But to some people looking in, it may look like it's as you said, undemocratic, but it's actually probably more democratic in some
Interesting.
respects.
There you go.
So,
Do we want to share the poll results now?
yes, let's go to the poll results.
And yes, Karen just asked, in my organization, directors are required to be members, and that is absolutely true in the law. They do need to be members. The question we were just discussing is whether they're the only members or not.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll end polling and share results. Okay, can everyone see those?
Okay.
So member discipline and removal. Most people felt it should be in the bylaws rather than policy. I concur. I don't know, do you concur?
Yeah, there's a reason why this is drafted in the way that the perspective, the point is made that way. It's really important to be clear how a member is going to be removed from membership. It is set out in the Societies Act. It is, however, my view that it's not a bad idea to have it in the bylaws so that you're reminded that you're to follow the rules of natural justice and procedural fairness, ensure that the individual has an opportunity to speak, etc. It is also a power that the directors can have. This is not always a well understood reality, but directors can do it. If directors want that power, it would need to be in their bylaws. Where I think we get into the funky stuff is that when you start talking about member discipline, very few bylaws ever include any aspect of discipline because it's really uncommon for us to discipline our members. I think you see that maybe a bit in the sporting environment or in garden societies where there are real rules around what can and cannot be in your garden, and issues like fire and so on. But for the most part, discipline isn't addressed. The difference here is that if you had a dispute with a member about discipline, that would go to the Civil Resolution Tribunal as of the changes to the CRTA. And however, if you just simply were tossing the member or expelling them is the language in the act, that would be going to court. So you can't actually challenge your removal before the Civil Resolution Tribunal, but you can challenge discipline. So there's a bit of tension there. And I think if you need to have disciplinary rules for your members, you may need to put them in your bylaws. But again, that at a minimum, that should be in a set of policies.
Yeah, one way to think about it is that if it's in your bylaws, that means that the members have, it's hardwired that members have an opportunity to think, to consider it, and to, they have a role in deciding whether it's an acceptable process or not. If it's a policy, it means that the board could change it. So if there's a high level of concern about policy, about who might get kicked out as a member, then it's better to put it in your bylaws, because it means that it's just got that higher level of accountability. And it doesn't have the perception of a board just making a decision among themselves quietly over in a corner about who should get to be a member or not, kind of thing. So whereas the process of disciplining a member, you might want to have in a policy, as long as, again, you've got a process for checking in on it regularly, making sure it's up to date. So it's thinking about what's the high level, really important thing that you would want members to be accountable for. And in the second one, overtime and staff volunteering, I think the same, if you think about the same principle, you're all right. Most of you are right that it should be a policy rather than a bylaw, because you wouldn't want your members engaging in a big discussion about whether overtime, because there's legal requirements here that are a risk for the organization. If you had a bunch of members deciding that the staff shouldn't get paid when they come to an event because they're dancing, that's a problem, because you can't have the staff show up at an event, even if they're dancing, without them acting as an employee. So you got to think that through. So you need policy, not bylaw.
Right.
For sure.
What about the next one?
The next one, board discipline and removal. That is a tough one. Again, similar to member discipline and removal, in that it's kind of, again, the board, any situation you've got the board deciding how it's going to discipline and remove itself, you've got a little bit of a challenge, because then that would be the case with a policy, that a board can pass a policy that says, we can remove board members when we don't like them anymore. And the members are saying, wait a minute, we want that board member because of this. So you need to have that probably in your bylaws, I would say.
Yeah. So here's where I think we also see this funny stuff, because boards generally want the power to decide when a director should be taught. Yeah. So they do include it in bylaws. What I do see quite a bit of, which I would discourage, is this idea that we miss 3 meetings, you're out. The whole thing about how many meetings people can go to or not, how to deal with somebody who's absent a great deal. Those things really should be in policy.
Yes.
Because you need the discretion to be able to say, oh, this person, you just found out this person is dealing with a major health crisis. And, you want to take that into account. I think there was a time when we put that 3 strikes, you're out bylaw in, because it was a way to deal with people that just weren't showing up.
But I don't think that's the best way to deal with people not showing up. I mean, I think the board chair has a role to check in with that person, find out why they're not showing up. Because they're still, if they're not taking an actual leave from the board, they're still responsible for all the board decisions. Exactly. So that is an important thing that needs to be addressed when someone's not showing up. And the best way to address it is through policy and practice, frankly, not even just policy.
And I think and this is where I think board training really makes a big difference. Yeah. So many people start societies or get involved with the society, and the first thing that every society should be doing, even the biggest, even the most sophisticated, they should have an hour of facilitated discussion about board roles and responsibilities at that first meeting. Yeah. Because if I had $1 for every time that a director has said to me, well, I really didn't understand my role. Yeah. And that often leads them into situations where I'm needed because something went wrong. Yeah. And nobody took the time to think that or there wasn't enough time spent actually talking to one another about, do we know what we're doing here?
Mm-hmm.
It isn't
Mm-hmm.
just about the mission. It's
Yeah.
about making sure, can you read a set of financial statements? Why no? That's not something I've ever done. Oh, good. So we'll invite our accountant in. To everybody will learn a little bit more about what our specific,
Mm-hmm.
where our earned revenue is. What do we mean by that? What
Mm-hmm.
equipment we have? Do we have equipment? Really? I didn't know that. All those kinds of conversations.
Totally. And I
Which,
think Beverly's made a good point in the chat line that not showing up to board meetings could reflect a lack of engagement, which could absolutely be happening between meetings. Not, they may be showing up for meetings, but they're not engaged in any other way. And that needs to be addressed in a similar way, is to have the board chair or someone else in the board, possibly the ED in some circumstances, connect with that person and work hard, like find ways to engage them better or invite them to leave. If a board member is not happy, they should move on. So yeah.
un- unhappy people always brings up the next one, which is
Yes,
conflict resolution, because we're
exactly.
all a bunch of monkeys fighting
Yeah.
over a banana.
And
So,
yeah, I firmly believe that should be a policy, because it needs to reflect your values as an organization, and it shouldn't be in your bylaws, because there's so many different ways, and an organization can evolve, and they could have more staff or different board positions or more training or this or that. So really needs to be a policy, and it's an important policy.
yeah, and not in your bylaws.
Yes, and people need to follow it too, right? Like, that's the biggest thing with conflict resolution. People set up systems to manage it, and then a conflict arises and they decide they're going to deal with it informally, and I'm not going to follow the policy, but your policy could include informal processes to deal with it.
And it is another area where I think that training should be sought out, particularly where you're responsible for respectful workplace policies.
Yeah.
And at least somebody needs to be reasonably informed about where the resources are in the community that you can access to get support if there is a conflict, and not kind of flail around, which I think there's quite a bit of flailing that happens in this space, unfortunately. And we have some great resource Clea Parfit gave us 2 weeks ago from her conversation about respectful work. What's a good internal investigation look like?
Mm-hmm.
So I really recommend, for those of you who have that on your mind, have a look at that.
Yeah, and when you're in a good place, like a board and staff are in a good relationship, that's a really good time to develop a conflict resolution policy for when the ED and the board aren't getting along, to establish some principles for how best to address it should a conflict arise, because usually these things happen after the conflicts happen. But let's I want to go to some of the questions, because let's just skim through the rest. I knew we would have trouble with them, but remuneration for, I can never say that word, for directors, a little bit of a mix here. I actually think it should be in the bylaws, at least that board members can be paid has to be in your bylaws if you're going to pay them. Otherwise, the assumption is they're not to be paid. And then also the process for deciding how much directors should be paid, I actually think should be in the bylaws as well. But that policy, you could have as policy the amount at any given time, but generally,
it has to be disclosed on your financial statements if you're remunerating.
Exactly. So you do have to declare it all.
But whether or not you're remunerating directors, it should be in bylaw.
Yeah, because you should. Yeah.
And many funders will require it.
Your members do need to. Like gaming does.
Yeah.
With it. So, board job descriptions, definitely policy. Don't get into that in bylaws, because you might want to change it as an organization grows or shrinks or whatever. So
yeah,
definitely there.
And very fun fact, the roles that are described, or the positions that are described in the model bylaws, that is not out of the Societies Act. The Societies Act is silent. I think that it's most important that you actually have job descriptions, even though those descriptions in the bylaws can be helpful. You really need job descriptions. So
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably important to have in your bylaws how you're going to elect your executive members or your board chair, but what the chair does, you should leave to the policy. So,
yeah,
and privacy and confidentiality, yeah, same should really be a policy.
policies.
Budget and process and calendar should also be a policy. I think that putting in your bylaws just it limits the organization too much because things can change in that regard. Equal opportunity and diversity, again, if you want members to make it specific, if you want, like, again, thinking any of these things, it's sort of how sticky do you want this concept to be for the organization? And I think equal opportunity and diversity generally is something that should be in a policy statement, should be in value statements, should be part of HR. It should show up in a variety of ways. It's quite possible you could have something in the bylaws about it. For example, if you have board, you want to ensure that board positions reflect diversity and inclusion, you might want that to be in your bylaws.
Sure, but beyond that, I mean, I think that it's also important for people to understand that a lot of these or more broad policies that you think are a good idea, they don't belong in your bylaws because they're unenforceable under the Societies Act. Where they are enforceable is in the Human Rights Code or in other avenues. So I think it's really important. By all means, have a motherhood statement, have your mission, vision, values reflect your commitments here. But and perhaps there's a composition of directors that you do want to make sure is, at least X number of so and so being a director. Beyond that, don't go there.
Yeah.
It belongs.
No, I wouldn't think so either. But if you have an Indigenous organization, for example, may want to have in their bylaws that, the majority or,
they do.
8 of 10 have to be Indigenous or something like that. And then membership voting rights should be in your bylaws for sure. Member rights you might have policies around other things outside of actual voting and AGM principles. But yeah. So let's stop share there. And then
go to the Q&A.
Yeah.
Where can you find examples of policies? I've looked everywhere.
Well, there's a few spots. Our Vantage Point website under downloadable resources has a few things, like we have board job descriptions, for example. I think there might be a financial policy. It's surprising how hard it is to find. I know that so Board Source, which is an American website, does have some example policies. The other one I'm thinking, BC Nonprofit Housing Association, they actually have a whole whack of policies. They're just updating now that they sell as a whole package that you can buy. The ones they have right now are a bit dated, and a lot of them are about housing, but there are governance policies as well and HR policies and things that are pretty good. And that's, so they're updating that, so that will be available. Yeah. And how about you, Martha? Do you have other suggestions?
No, well, we have a link to Governing Good on our website, the Dalhousie, formerly the Dalhousie policy stuff that was created, which I kind of like the language of those because I found them pretty easy to understand, and there wasn't a lot of jargon. But I'm not familiar with the Board Source ones, and I'm, and of course I've seen the bylaws, the policy binder that you created that was pretty darn good. But
the Bill Reid Gallery, someone just posted, they have all their policies online, and you will find some organizations have posted their policies online as well, and a lot of groups are willing to share too. So sometimes emailing some EDs, to say, do you have an example of this policy?
Especially like-minded, like if in the arts, because there may be some specific considerations, like the donation of artwork, where you might not see that in Vantage Point. I don't know.
Yeah, no, we definitely don't have artwork.
So, interesting question. Are prescriptive policies another term for procedures?
I mean, I guess it's a bit semantics, frankly. Prescriptive was just a way to think about them, and procedures is another way to think about similar things. But when we talk about procedures, we're not always talking about a formal policy that's been passed by the board. Sometimes you're talking about, here's the procedures for paying invoices, for example. Now, some of that might be something that should be a policy, like somebody needs to approve certain payments out the door. If it's a certain amount that there has to be approval for. So I think of procedures often as a bit broader than when I think of a policy that is a prescriptive policy that's limiting a certain, setting some certain boundaries. Again, kind of often more high level than a procedure. That's how I would think about it.
Yeah, I might even say that a prescriptive policy example would be respectful workplace policies. And the procedures are the ones that implement the policy. So I don't know that it really goes to whether or not it's prescriptive, although in this case
Right.
it really is because WorkSafe requires it.
Right.
But it really is a, operationalizing of a policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe it's only is it only prescriptive policies that have procedures that are necessary to implement them? I don't know. That's maybe too.
That's probably too fine tuned. There's probably other, yeah. For the most part, I think you're probably right there, but
Right.
I could think of some prescriptive policies that might.
So, one of this, I'm sure, has come up partly as a consequence of our conversation. The language in our current bylaws indicates the secretary of the board issues notices of meetings of the society and directors, but this is currently done by our ED. Maybe that should change. Kind of goes to what we were talking about, the positions that are described in the model bylaw set. They don't go to the point of often these activities or these these jobs are actually delegated to the executive director to do. So
yeah, and I mean, I think when we have a policy in place that states that somebody's supposed to do something or something's supposed to happen, but in practice that isn't what's happening, the question to raise is not necessarily do we have to go back to the other way of that the policy is drafted. The one question you can ask is, how old is this policy and is it still relevant? Like, is it still true? Like, do we need to change the policy? So you need to ask yourself, why are we not following the policy? And you consider changing it.
You bring up something else really important, which is that some bylaws are really old, and you, Robert, may have bylaws that are based on the Schedule B bylaw set, which are different from the Model 1 bylaws, which were attached to the New Societies Act in one important respect. In the new ones, they say that the secretary will do or make the necessary arrangements for the following things to be done.
Right.
Whereas the Schedule Bs said the secretary will do X, Y, and Z, which is an important distinction because boards, I think it is useful actually to have in your bylaws what the secretary does, what the treasurer does in broad strokes, but always with the language and make the necessary arrangements for, so that then the board will pass a resolution saying, well, we're delegating this to the director pursuant to the executive director, pursuant to our policy on, custody of documents or on, or how board meetings are going to run. Notices will go out a week ahead of time, or 2 days, or 3 days, or by WhatsApp, or whatever, all that good stuff. So,
yeah, and same with policies too. It's about being clear, thinking through a little bit about how flexible you want to be with policy around who is going to do the job. But by doing it that way, by saying the secretary is responsible for seeing this done, then if you're not doing it that way, the policy still stands, but it still makes the secretary accountable to make sure it's being done. And that's really important, especially with a treasurer. because the treasurer job is so different for every organization. And if the treasurer is responsible for ensuring that financial statements are produced every month, that most organizations wouldn't assume they're doing the bookkeeping. But they need to check in to make sure that those statements are being produced and asking for them if they're not. So,
Right.
so that's like, I think it's important to be flexible, but the point is to keep board members, because of their liability, still responsible and accountable for it, even if they don't have to do it.
And I think that the next question really goes to the bylaws need to be reviewed like policies on an ongoing basis. Bylaws are living documents, so are policies. And so when you say, the bylaws should state who the members are, the problem comes when a small group starts an organization. Shouldn't the organization discuss this in a bylaw review? Absolutely, yes. I think that Alison and I, as we were preparing for this, we're talking about, what is certainly the first and most important question that every society must ask itself. Who are our members and why are they our members? Now, the extent to which you set that out in your bylaws is very much going to depend on the kind of organization it is. And we want maximum flexibility here, because if you're going to have criteria for membership, it will be important for you to set that out in some fashion, but that may be, depending on the organization, one of those things you want to actually get legal advice on, because a lot can stay, an organization, as the Delta Hospice is discovering, can fall if this provision is not carefully considered and understood, and also goes to why we need to do regular board training, because boards do tend to turn over significantly over a year or 2 years. Enough people will have left that it's important to bring us back to sort of values, first principles, all that good stuff. So, why does a board self-assessment practice need to be a policy versus a practice in a board charter or manual?
Well, it doesn't have to be. That's the nice thing about policies, is very few of them have to be. But the reason to have it be at least part of a manual, well, again, it's good practice to do regular board self-assessments. If you don't have it in a policy statement about how the board functions, then the risk is that 1 year a board will just decide, let's not do it. I mean, they could still do it if it's in a policy, if it's not, because they can change the policy, right? They have the authority to do that. But the point is to try to articulate practices that you want to ingrain in the organization in a long-term way. But absolutely, it can be a practice. The reality is the board self-assessments can be done in a variety of ways. I mean, Vantage Point, after every board meeting, has a little moment where they say, how was this board meeting? So, you can do that work in a variety of ways. It's the commitment to doing it that matters. And so if you need to put it in policy to make it clear to everybody why it matters, then do it. If you don't worry about it. Don't make a policy out of something, because anyone, including me, told you it should be a policy. That is not a reason to make it a policy. You need to decide as an organization whether you need the policy. So
that, though, I will say that when I tell you to have a policy, it might not be a good idea.
It's a good point. If a lawyer tells you you ought to have a policy, you should have a policy. But for the most part, when people say you must have a policy on this, be okay about thinking that through a little bit.
I agree completely. I just had to say that as the person who sometimes tells people, but then the next question is, well, do you have an example? And I have to say that we're working on a few. Membership policy is really the biggest one, and we'll have something, we're going to do a webinar next spring. We'll do it in 2 parts, specifically because this is the question that comes up the most. Really key question from Natalie. I think this will be our last question, unless you want to spend another few minutes, Alison. Can you say more about what types of policies would be approved by senior staff instead of a board? important.
Yeah. Well, again, some of this depends a little bit on the size of the organization, whether you have a working board in the sense of how engaged your board is in some of this, because they may be involved. But I would say that, what's a good example? Well, it might be how you handle petty cash. Like that's something that the board doesn't need to approve that in most circumstances. They just need to know that you have a policy in place that you can show them if they ever asked, how do we handle petty cash? But you should have a policy that senior staff have passed. A lot of HR procedures and practices, you would have a staff, like the senior staff policy, some of which, again, high level, you'd want some board approval of overall to ensure that you're following proper procedures. But if guide office procedures, who gets to get access to the printer at certain times a day or something like that, like you may have a policy you need to put in place in order to clarify to the staff how it's going to work around something. So
here's the perfect one. Whose responsibility it is to clean the kitchen this week.
There you go.
Everybody's favorite. Look, we're gonna end it here just because we all have other things to do. And for those of you whose questions weren't answered, please send them to Ask a Law Student. A whole whack of them are like perfect for our law. We have 2 law students who are trained to answer these questions. And a lot of what you're asking is exactly the kind of question that we want to put up on our FAQs and the new FAQs in 2021. And they're all totally up the student's alley. Alison, thank you so much. I always learn so much whenever we do this and whenever we work together. We really, we try to do, honestly, I don't want to overstate this, but I don't think that PLEO would be where we are in terms of providing practical information for nonprofits if it hadn't been for your contributions over the years. Because I've always said, you don't need to know the law, you need to know how to apply it. It's the practice that matters. And practice ain't perfect. So we're here to help you. Practice is what we're doing. And
it's a good line from the, this is very personal, but the weight loss program I'm on right now, which is really awesome. But they have a line that it's not about perfection, it's about progress. So you can never achieve perfection in any of these things as long as you're progressing and moving forward. So I think that's an important message to remember, that you can never have a perfect policy, but the best you can do is try.
Right.
So and a lot of people shared some great things on chat. So hopefully you guys can capture those things around, like places to go to find it. And and I hope to meet you all again sometime. But thank you very much, Martha. That was a pleasure.
Great. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.